Margaret Atwood stated in her 1998 speech to the American History Forum that whoever tells you that history is not about individuals, only large trends and movements, is lying. She argues that history is nothing without memory, that forgetting is as important to the telling of historical stories as remembering. The question then follows, how do we know what we think we know about the past? This really is the crux of what Alias Grace, her 1996 novel, is all about. I'm Eddie. This is my series on Margaret Atwood's major works. Come join on this journey to the past. Alias Grace tells the story of the notorious Canadian murderess Grace Marks. She was sentenced to life in prison for the 1843 murders of Thomas Kinnear and Nancy Montgomery. She didn't carry out these murders alone, but with the help of James McDermott, another employee of Thomas Kinnear, who was hung for his involvement in the plot. Grace, now serving time and working for the governor of the prison in which she's based, is approached for interview by Dr. Simon Jordan, a psychologist who's kind of interested in approaching new forms of logic-based analysis and kind of working towards building a better asylums of the future. This novel is told to us in a variety of forms, including in letters sent to and from Dr. Simon Jordan, but mainly kind of takes place in conversations directly between Dr. Simon Jordan and Grace Marks, in which she recounts her life story and he tries to get to the root of the murders. Grace is skeptical of doctors, to say the least, and has kind of a big visceral emotional reaction when she first sees him at the governor's house, but she's eventually persuaded into telling her story. Originally an immigrant from Ireland, she grew up with an abusive father and a mother who died on the boat over from Ireland to Canada. She describes how she saw her mother's death happening in a dream before it actually did happen. In Canada, her father kind of falls into old habits of abusing alcohol, and she eventually goes to work as a house servant to kind of get out of her father's house. Simon doesn't really care about any of this. He just wants to know about the murders. He's like, why are you telling me all this background? It's like the meme of the dog where he's like, explanation only, no context, only explanation. Anyway, Grace ends up working as a servant, becomes close friends with Mary Whitney, one of the other house servants there. Mary acts as a kind of mentor to her, but ends up dying after a failed abortion, and she moves away from the house. She also makes the association of a peddler during this time, Jeremiah, who she also runs into on the way to what will be her final place of service as a free person, the house of Thomas Kinnear. Meanwhile, in the present, Dr. Jordan is having some difficulties. He's really going through it. Firstly, his mother wants him to get married so badly, to the point where he's considering marrying the daughter of the governor, Lydia, even though he doesn't particularly have much interest in her. Secondly, a committee that's backing him, that's kind of working towards the freedom of Grace Marks, is getting really impatient that these conversations aren't producing instant results. Thirdly, his landlady is falling into an increasingly perilous situation. Her husband is an alcoholic and has essentially abandoned her, and her servant has kind of been fired or left, depending on who you ask, the house in kind of a big huff, hasn't enjoyed working there at all. So Simon is kind of left as her one source of income. Finally, we end up talking about the house itself where the murders took place. Now, it's worth mentioning that in the novel, we've had a number of little like epistolary clips, little quotes from different newspapers and different accounts detailing the Grace Marks murders. Grace herself is said to have given 3 different versions of the events of the murders, she says, because of instruction from her lawyer. She also suffers amnesia surrounding some of the events of the actual murders themselves. Nonetheless, she eventually recounts the life that she had under Thomas Kinnear's house. He was a Tory landowner, essentially a very wealthy person, 6 years after a failed rebellion of the lower classes against kind of the rich landowning class. His house has something of an illicit reputation, specifically because of his relationship with Nancy, which Grace isn't fully aware of at the start. Nancy has moved from a house servant to being essentially the mistress of the house and has a sexual relationship with Thomas Kinnear, although they're not married or anything. Grace has a mixed relationship with the different people in the house. Kinnear flirts with her. Nancy goes between kind of wanting to be her best friend and being very jealous of the kind of relationship that she has with Thomas Kinnear. The surly McDermott wants her to be his beau, but he also sees her as kind of uppity or having pretensions above her station. Jeremiah once again pops up at the house and kind of offers Grace the option of running away and becoming like a double act with him, in which she'll kind of fake reading fortunes, they'll kind of swindle people on a circus circuit. Back in the present, Dr. Jordan is introduced to a Dr. Dupont, an expert in hypnosis. Simon is very dubious about the benefits of such medical practice, but under increasing pressure both from the committee to free Grace Marks and also from his landlady, with whom he has started an illicit affair after kind of mistaking her for Grace in the middle of the night, and yeah, things happened. He's terrified that that's going to come to light. So he agrees to let the hypnosis take place. What he doesn't know, and what Grace reveals to us, is that Dr. Dupont is Jeremiah. Under hypnosis, the supposedly submerged presence of Mary Whitney, Grace's old friend, comes to the presence, and she admits that it was her that committed the murders, that Grace had no knowledge of them. Yeah, it's this whole big shocking sequence to the people that are assembled there. Jordan leaves, fleeing under the pretense of his mother being ill, and, you know, gives up on his attempts to get Grace a pardon. She kind of continues to tell him the story of her life in a letter in which she recounts how she and McDermott escaped, how McDermott was insistent that she had told him that she would give herself to him in exchange for carrying out the murders, and yeah, of their eventual capture as well. Grace eventually is, however, pardoned after around 20 years and ends up getting married to Jamie Walsh, a young boy who worked on Thomas Kinnear's land and had testified against her during her trial and later came to regret it. Jordan loses his memory fighting in the American Civil War, and Grace ends the novel unsure whether she is pregnant or whether she has a malignant tumour. So what I presented to you in this novel is a fairly straightforward story. Grace grows up in an abusive household, she watches the death of her close friend, and then, you know, eventually has some kind of psychotic break and carries out some murders without even knowing it. Seems like a very neat story that we've all read loads of times or seen on TV in kind of detective stories. The main problem with that is whatever the story of the murder of Thomas Kinnear and Nancy Montgomery is almost certainly not that. To any reader paying the least bit of attention, we reach the scene of the hypnosis and we are skeptical of the results it produces, to say the least. It feels way too convenient, especially since we know that the hypnotist is no such thing, and that the two had previously talked about swindling people in the past in a kind of circus act. So, in all likeliness, Grace has used the alias, of Mary Whitney as a kind of scapegoat onto which to put the crimes, the murders, allowing her to become a redeemed figure that could then be pardoned. And as we look through this novel, we can see that Grace is a big editor of her own story. She frequently omits information when talking to Dr. Jordan. She fails to discuss her dreams with him, for example, even though they're probably quite juicy psychologically, because she kind of sees it as a private issue. Likewise, when he brings her a radish after she asks him to, she says that she's, you know, going to spice up the story, make it a little bit more interesting, because one good turn deserves another. We should never forget that this story is being recounted to us, that she is an incredibly gifted storyteller. And it also feeds into why it was so easy for the hypnosis ruse to actually work. Grace claims throughout the novel to have amnesia, and yet Mary Whitney is able to recount the details of the murder very clearly. How could this happen? It's then that you realise we're not the only ones that are kind of reading the little bits of newspaper clippings that we're seeing in this novel. Grace has heard the different stories of Grace Marks. She's seen how she was described in court by others, including McDermott and Jamie Walsh. She's kind of seen the newspaper clippings that the governor's wife has of her. And Grace is able to use these different contradictory strands in order to construct her own narrative, in order to gain power for herself. Indeed, a big theme of this novel is perception. When Grace is on trial, she notes that the newspapers wrote down that both her and McDermott were from Ireland of their own admission, as if being Irish was inherently a crime. Likewise, Grace is able to know that the court is going to find her guilty as soon as Jamie Walsh identifies her as still being in Nancy's dress. Appearances are everything in society, and Grace's gender means that different expectations are placed upon her, and society is not going to take her seriously in the way that it would a man. Simon himself, it's made clear, is deeply concerned about appearances and is bearing a lot of his own baggage. We believe at the start of the novel that he is the one with power over Grace. He's educated, he's a doctor, he's a man, and yet her accounting of Kinnear's relationship with his servant brings something out of Simon that was previously concealed. He's clearly very attracted to Grace. This is something that she calls out herself when she is under the guise of Mary Whitney, but he also begins an affair with his landlady, a kind of illicit affair with a married woman. His behaviour does not at all fit in with the veneer of 1840s Canadian sensibilities, and this shame causes him to flee and enlist in the army, meaning he's never able to get to the bottom of the Grace Marks murders, or start his asylum. As a general note of caution, even though we can see Grace is this master storyteller, that doesn't mean we come to any kind of clear conclusion. This isn't like a rug pull away moment where we realise that Grace has been manipulating everyone the whole time and she knows the truth of the story. In fact, I'd argue the opposite. McDermott, in Grace's recounting, insists that she promised herself to him, but she has no recollection of doing this. This isn't something that she's hiding from us, it's something that she genuinely doesn't remember. How do we account for the flashes that she sees, the visions? She herself isn't able to interpret them. Grace is a character with a lot of things buried deep. She sees this repeated image of a man standing at the top of the stairs, blocking her exit. This can be read in a couple of ways. It could be her abusive father. It could be Dr. Jordan, like kind of trying to control her. And moreover, the red cloth peonies that she keeps seeing as sprouting everywhere. It's kind of an image that doesn't have a clear explanation in the novel. Simon definitely doesn't see it as significant. He hilariously kind of comments that he doesn't know anything about flowers, so he isn't interested. He's really doing the work. Yeah, we don't get a key fix on what they represent. This highlights one of the key issues in the novel. The gap between Simon's rational worldview and his attempt to rationalise everything, and Grace's worldview. When he brings her a beat, he's expecting her to make the connection of, you know, underground, murder, dead bodies, stuff like that. When she sees the beat, she's like, yeah, dude, it's really good for cooking. Love a good beat. Simon's attempt to fix everything in this novel into strict logical boxes is an attempt at power. It's an attempt at control. Grace describes it as kind of writing things, etching things into her skin. There's this rationality, Torah notes, that kind of acts as a metaphorical prison to add to Grace's actual prison. But it's not just a prison for her, it's a prison for him as well. One final theme that Atwood has talked about extensively is the theme of historical narrative and historical writing itself. In the case of this novel, she came across the story of Grace Marks originally in the writings of Susanna Moodie in the 1970s. Moodie, who met Grace in 1851, describes her as a woman with like a demented passion and anger who seduced McDermott into carrying out the crimes on her behalf. She ends her account by saying, look, I hope that she's been like this her entire life, because if she has a chance of being saved in the afterlife. Atwood says that she originally took this account at face value, but when she came back to look at it in the 1990s, she realised how fictional the non-fiction was. Yeah, the accounts of the murders by Grace Marks are entirely inconsistent. Some people say the house was tidy after the murder, some people say it was a wreck, some people say that Grace herself is a demon, other people say that she was a pliable, like, pitiable woman. People also had the rebellion of 6 years earlier still very fresh in their mind when they were looking at someone who had murdered a landed gentleman. It's in the gaps of this ambiguity that Alias Grace thrives. Atwood made sure that everything that was an actual historical event, like bona fide, definitely happened, is included in the novel. She wasn't going to change any of that. But beyond that, she was free to kind of mess with the plot as much as she wanted. For example, Dr. Jordan and Jeremiah are both fictional characters, as far as I'm aware. Jeremiah is a character thick with metaphorical resonance. All of his alternate egos, his aliases, are related to bridges, whether it's Dupont or Bridges. Yeah, and he's able to act as a bridge for Grace and for Grace's soul. Atwood argues that all historical novels are inherently contemporary, something that seems quite self-evident. She says that if the story of Grace had been written in the Victorian era, she would have finished the novel by saying, "Ah yes, it all comes back to me now." Celine Dion style. We, however, cannot know who killed Nancy. We can't know if Grace is guilty or not. Atwood doesn't provide that as an answer for us. The novel itself even intentionally ends on an unsure note, on top of an unsure note. Jordan has lost his memory. He's now suffering from amnesia himself, and his mother notes that he accidentally calls his new wife, whose name is Faith, Grace, which is pretty funny. Yeah, he's lost access to the truth. Grace herself is either dying or bringing new life into the world, showing the kind of balance that she's always had between life and death throughout the novel, but Dr. Jordan has as well. I like Alias Grace. I think that Atwood really shows the depth of her craft in this novel. I like that she subverts expectations and doesn't offer any easy answers. Well worth a read if for some reason you've already got to the end of this video and haven't read the book. Let me know what you thought of this novel. Let me know if you have any interpretations yourself of what went down. Who's guilty? Who did it? Was it Grace? I don't know, do you? And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. I've got a whole series on Margaret Atwood's works. Check out this video, which will be an Atwood video probably. Bye.